In every town there are secrets people don't want spoken. In Santa Aurora, the silence had lasted too long. Parents whispered about missing children, but officials told them to wait, to trust. Nothing changed until Bravo. He was not a politician, not a priest, not a man with power. He was a dog, scarred by years of training, eyes sharp as flint. One evening, when a mother named Isabella thought all hope was lost, Bravo leapt into the river and returned with more than just a boy. He returned with proof that the silence could be broken. The story spread like fire. People who had grown numb began to feel again. Rage, grief, and finally, determination. And as prosecutors, journalists, and entire communities began to circle the truth, one thing became clear. Bravo had dragged more than a child from the water. He had pulled out the courage of a nation. The town of Santa Aurora stirred awake beneath a veil of pale mist. The Paraná River, wide and slow, stretched like a ribbon of silver across the horizon, its surface catching the fragile glow of the rising sun. Fishermen prepared their nets along the worn wooden docks, their voices low and steady, as if not to disturb the stillness of the morning. The river smelled of damp earth and reeds, its whispers filling the air with a lull that had comforted generations of men who lived by its edge. Officer Javier Ramirez stood on the embankment, his boots dampened by the dew, watching his partner pace. The German shepherd at his side, known across Santa Aurora as Bravo, seemed unsettled. His ears pricked forward, nose testing the shifting currents of air. Ramirez knew the dog well enough to recognize when instinct had stirred something beyond his own comprehension. "Easy, viejo," Ramirez murmured, patting Bravo's shoulder. The dog's muscles quivered beneath his hand. Bravo wasn't agitated in the way of a dog distracted by birds or stray cats. This was different. His eyes scanned the riverbank, sharp, searching, as though the mist itself concealed a secret he could not yet reach. The fishermen noticed, too. A few cast sidelong glances at the shepherd, their brows tightening. In Santa Aurora, dogs were trusted. A restless dog meant the world itself was restless. One old man, Mateo Alvarez, who had lived by the river for over 70 years, muttered to his companion, "Ese perro sabe algo. Something's coming." The words hung in the morning air. Ramirez walked the narrow footpath along the bank, letting Bravo lead. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but he had learned long ago, in his 12 years of service, to trust the instincts of a good canine. Bravo had saved lives before, sniffing out hidden drugs in a dockside truck, tracking a missing hiker through the forest. Yet the way he pulled now, steady, insistent, unsettled something deep in Ramirez's chest. The mist thinned as the sun climbed higher. Boats drifted slowly into the current, oars creaking. Ramirez greeted the fishermen as he passed, but their eyes remained fixed on Bravo. The dog paused at the edge of the river, chest heaving, gaze locked on the dark water. He whined softly, pawing at the stones. Ramirez crouched beside him, staring at the river's sheen. Nothing appeared unusual, just water rippling against the reeds, driftwood caught in tangles along the shore. Yet Bravo would not move. His tail stood rigid, ears forward, every muscle waiting for a command Ramirez didn't know how to give. "You'll wear a hole in the ground," Ramirez said gently, but there was unease in his voice. The town behind them was waking. Doors opened, roosters crowed. The scent of bread baking drifted on the air. To anyone else, it was just another morning in Santa Aurora. But to Bravo, and increasingly to Ramirez, something was wrong, something unseen. And though Ramirez didn't yet know it, The river was about to surrender its secret. The town of Santa Aurora looked gentle from the outside, as if nothing bad could ever take root in its cobbled streets and sun-worn houses. Yet, beneath the calm surface, shadows had begun to creep into the lives of its people, shadows that most were too frightened to name aloud. In a modest home near the edge of town, Isabella Cruz moved quietly about her morning chores. The house, once filled with laughter, had grown quieter since her husband vanished months before. Some said he had gone north in search of work. Others whispered that he had been swallowed by debts too heavy to pay. Isabella had stopped trying to correct the rumors. She simply carried on, holding the weight of survival in her hands and pouring all the light she had left into her 4-year-old son, Mateo. Mateo was the kind of child who carried joy like a lantern. Even in their modest home, with peeling paint and a roof patched more than once, he found ways to laugh, racing a toy truck across the uneven floorboards, or singing nonsense songs to the stray cat that sometimes lingered by their window. Isabella would watch him, a mixture of exhaustion and tenderness in her eyes, marveling at how a child could still believe in magic when the world around them seemed intent on dimming it. That morning she braided his dark hair back from his face, smiling at the way he wriggled on the stool, too impatient to sit still. "Mamá, rápido," he pleaded, his eyes glinting with mischief. "You'll thank me when you can see," she teased softly, kissing the top of his head. After breakfast, a simple piece of bread and warm milk, Mateo ran out to play in the small dirt yard. Isabella lingered in the doorway, watching him chase a butterfly with arms outstretched. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of peace. It was fragile, but it was hers. Then came the silence. One heartbeat he was there, darting toward the fence, his laughter echoing. The next, the yard was empty. The butterfly drifted upward into the sky. But the boy was gone. "Mateo?" Isabella called, her voice light at first, almost playful. She expected him to pop out from behind the woodpile or crouch near the tomato plants, but no answer came. She stepped into the yard, eyes sweeping every corner. "Mateo, cariño, ya basta. Come out." Her voice grew sharper, edged with fear. The yard was too small for him to vanish so completely. She ran to the fence, glanced down the narrow alley. Nothing. Her heart began to pound so loudly, it seemed to fill her ears. Neighbors looked up from their chores as Isabella's voice broke into a cry. "My son, he's gone! Mateo!" She stumbled through the street, calling, searching, tears already clouding her sight. Doors opened, faces appeared, some rushing to help, others watching with that familiar heaviness in their eyes. It was not the first time Santa Aurora had heard such cries. Word spread faster than smoke on the wind. Mothers clutched their children tighter, pulling them inside. Men formed small search groups, fanning out along the alleys and toward the riverbank. Isabella ran with them, her breath ragged, whispering prayers between sobs. She imagined him tripping, falling, lost somewhere he could not call back to her. Yet a deeper dread gnawed at her. The dread born of rumors she had overheard in the market, murmurs about children vanishing from nearby villages, never to return. By afternoon, the police had arrived. Officer Ramirez himself came to her door, Bravo trotting at his side. Ramirez's face was carved with concern, his eyes scanning every detail of the yard as if it might speak the truth aloud. "Senora Cruz," he said softly, "tell me everything. When did you last see him?" Her words tumbled out in broken pieces, hands trembling. "He was here. He was just here, playing in the yard. I turned, only for a moment. And then..." She could not finish. Ramirez placed a steady hand on her shoulder. We will find him. I promise you that. But the promise did little to still her shaking. She could see the doubt in the faces of her neighbors, in the way they exchanged quiet glances when they thought she could not see. Everyone knew the stories, though few dared repeat them aloud. Children taken, families left hollow, whispers of men who dealt in shadows, selling innocence like stolen goods. As the sun lowered, casting long arms of shadow across Santa Aurora, Isabella sat on the threshold of her home, staring at the empty yard where Mateo's laughter had once echoed. The town moved around her, hushed, restless. Some came to comfort her, offering food, a hand, a prayer. Others avoided her gaze, unwilling to look at the reflection of their own worst fear. The evening bell rang from the church tower, its sound carrying over the rooftops. Isabella clutched her rosary, whispering her husband's name, her son's name, every saint she could recall. And though her lips moved in prayer, her heart was breaking. For in Santa Aurora, when a child disappeared, the air itself seemed to know whether they would return. And tonight, the air was heavy, thick with silence. The police station in Santa Aurora was little more than a squat brick building, with paint flaking from its shutters. But that evening, it pulsed with urgency. The usual hum of paperwork and idle talk had been replaced by the sharp ring of telephones, the shuffle of boots, and the low murmur of townsfolk who had gathered outside. Word had spread, and with it came a familiar dread. Inside, Isabella Cruz sat hunched on a wooden chair, her hands knotted tightly around the edge of her shawl. Her eyes were swollen, the skin beneath them bruised from hours of crying. She looked like a woman hollowed out, her body present but her spirit elsewhere. Out there on the streets, in the fields, by the river, anywhere her son might still be. Officer Javier Ramirez stood across the desk, Bravo at his side. The shepherd rested his chin on his paws, eyes locked on Isabella, as if sensing her despair. Ramirez lowered his voice, choosing his words carefully. "Senora Cruz," he said, "we need to record everything. Even the smallest detail may help us bring Mateo home." Isabella nodded, but when she tried to speak, her throat closed. She pressed her hand against her chest, willing her breath to return. Finally, in a trembling voice, she recounted the moments of the morning, Mateo's laughter, the butterfly, the silence that followed. Each sentence broke her a little more, until by the end she was gripping the table, sobbing. He was just there, and then he wasn't. Dios mío, what if I never see him again? Ramirez reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. His voice carried the firmness of a man trained to command, yet softened with the weight of empathy. "Listen to me. I have worked alongside Bravo for 6 years. We have found lost hikers in the forest, children who wandered into the marshes. We do not give up. I will not stop searching for your boy." Isabella looked at him then, truly looked, as if trying to measure the depth of his promise. In his eyes, she saw no easy comfort, no false assurances, only a steady fire, a determination she clung to like a drowning woman to driftwood. She whispered, "Please, bring him back to me." Outside the station, the town had gathered in uneasy clusters. Some offered food and warm drinks to the officers. Others embraced Isabella as she stepped outside, murmuring prayers and encouragement. An old woman kissed her forehead, pressing a rosary into her palm. "He will return, Hija. The Virgin watches over children." Yet behind those gestures of kindness, a current of fear ran strong. In hushed voices, neighbors recalled other names, children who had disappeared in recent years. A boy from San Miguel, last seen near the market. A girl from a nearby village, gone after dusk. None had been found. Each name was a scar on the town's memory, whispered but never healed. Some fathers clenched their fists, vowing to join the search through the night. Others pulled their children closer, warning them not to stray beyond the doorstep. And some, though they said nothing, avoided Isabella's gaze altogether. Their silence spoke of resignation, of the belief that once the shadows took a child, they rarely returned them. Ramirez stepped outside, Bravo trotting beside him. The crowd turned toward him, waiting. He raised his voice so all could hear. "We begin the search tonight. Every road, every alley, every stretch of the river will be checked. We will not rest until Mateo is found." A murmur rippled through the crowd, hope mixed with doubt. Mothers nodded fiercely, clinging to his words. Fathers pressed lanterns into his hands. Still, some eyes lowered, as if afraid to place too much faith in a promise that life in Santa Aurora had broken before. Isabella stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the rosary clutched in her hand. She felt both held by the kindness around her and isolated by the unspoken fear. The town wanted to believe in miracles, but it had been taught to expect tragedies. Ramirez crouched, tightening Bravo's harness. The dog's ears twitched, nose quivering, as if already pulling at a thread of scent the others could not see. Ramirez glanced back at Isabella. "Trust him," he said. "If there is a trail, Bravo will find it." For the first time that day, Isabella managed a fragile nod. Her faith was not in systems or uniforms. It was in the dog who had already sensed something at the river, the dog whose eyes carried a promise beyond words. As the search parties dispersed into the night, lanterns bobbing like fireflies across the darkened streets, Santa Aurora held its breath. The town was divided between hope and fear, but in Isabella's heart, only one truth remained. Her son was out there somewhere, waiting, and she would not stop praying until he was returned to her arms. The first light of dawn bled slowly across the Paraná, brushing the water with streaks of gold that did little to lift the heaviness hanging over Santa Aurora. The fishermen gathered as they always did, their silhouettes bending over nets and ropes, their voices low and gravelly from years of river air. The town had hardly slept. Whispers of Mateo's disappearance had spread like wildfire, and though no one spoke it openly, every man who cast his net that morning carried the weight of the boy in his chest. Officer Javier Ramirez was back at the riverbank, his eyes hollow from a sleepless night. He had led search parties through the alleys and fields until exhaustion forced them to stop. But Bravo, his steadfast partner, had not stilled. Even now, the German shepherd tugged at the leash, pacing, nose to the wind, restless in a way Ramirez knew meant only one thing. The trail was close, though not yet revealed. The fishermen had begun to notice. "Ese perro no descansa," one muttered, shaking his head. "That dog knows something." Bravo's ears pricked sharply, his body going taut. Before Ramirez could react, the shepherd lunged forward, dragging him toward the water's edge. "Bravo, wait!" Ramirez called, tightening his grip. But the dog was already in the river, plunging into the current with a force that stunned the onlookers. The fishermen dropped their nets, rushing toward the edge. The river was not gentle at that hour. Its pull was strong, tugging at anything foolish enough to enter. Ramirez's boots slipped against the stones as he braced himself, rope burn forming in his palms from the leash. But Bravo swam with a furious determination, his shoulders cutting through the water, his gaze fixed on something drifting just beyond the reeds. At first, it looked like debris, a dark, heavy shape bobbing in the current. A log, perhaps, or a piece of discarded cargo from an upstream barge. But then the fisherman saw the straps, the square edges, the way it dipped and resurfaced like something weighted. One man whispered, "Dios mío, it's a suitcase." Ramirez's heart hammered. Contraband, a drowned body. He had seen enough of both in his career to know that whatever Bravo had fixed upon, it was no ordinary find. "Bravo, back!" Ramirez shouted, but the shepherd did not obey. The dog clamped his jaws around the thick handle of the suitcase and began hauling it toward shore. His legs churned against the current, his entire body straining with the effort. The fishermen waded into the shallows, calling encouragement, their hands outstretched to help pull the sodden weight ashore. Ramirez staggered into the water himself, seizing the handle as Bravo heaved it against the stones. The case thudded onto the bank, dripping, its edges battered from the river's unforgiving grip. Silence fell across the gathering crowd. The suitcase was locked, its seams straining as if something inside had pressed desperately against them. Ramirez's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed danger. He glanced at the fisherman, at Bravo, at the dark case that seemed to hum with foreboding. One man crossed himself. Another muttered, "Not another." His voice trailed off, swallowed by the river. Ramirez knelt, running a hand over the cold surface. Water streamed from its corners, pooling at his knees. He felt Bravo press close beside him, the dog's chest heaving, eyes never leaving the case. The shepherd gave a low whine, almost human in its urgency. "Contraband?" one fisherman asked. His voice was unsteady. "Or worse." Ramirez said nothing. His fingers lingered on the clasps, hesitating. He knew the weight of a drowned body, the smell of death that clung to waterlogged cargo. He had opened such cases before, and the memories still haunted his dreams. Yet something in Bravo's posture, alert, insistent, unwavering, told him this was different. The fishermen pressed closer, their faces drawn. The river lapped quietly against the stones, as if waiting. Ramirez exhaled slowly. His voice came low, firm. "Help me open it." Hands reached forward, steadying the suitcase. The clasps groaned as Ramirez forced them open, the crowd holding its breath. Inside could be anything: smuggled weapons, drugs, or the thing every man there feared most, a child claimed by the shadows of the trafficking rumors that had poisoned their town. And as the lid creaked, water spilling over the stones, Ramirez felt the entire weight of Santa Aurora, poised on the edge of revelation. The suitcase lay on the stones like something dragged from the depths of a nightmare. Its black fabric was torn, water dripping steadily from every seam, the stench of river mud clinging to it. The fishermen stood back, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow, as if the case itself carried a curse. Bravo paced beside it, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. Officer Javier Ramirez swallowed hard. His hands hovered over the latches, his heart thundering against his ribs. He had opened plenty of cases in his career, most filled with contraband, sometimes weapons, sometimes worse. But never had the air felt so heavy, so charged with dread. He could feel the fisherman's eyes pressing into his back, the silence of the river stretching long, broken only by Bravo's insistent whine. "Help me," Ramirez said finally, his voice gravelly. Two fishermen stepped forward reluctantly, crossing themselves before kneeling beside him. Together, their fingers fumbled with the swollen clasps. The metal screeched as it gave way, a sound that made every man wince. The lid opened. For a moment, no one breathed. Inside, curled unnaturally within the confines of the case, was a child. His wrists bound with coarse rope, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate intervals. His skin was pale, lips tinged a frightening blue. His hair clung wet to his forehead, his eyes shut, as if he were already halfway across a threshold no one dared name. "Dios santo," one fisherman whispered, staggering back. Another dropped to his knees, clutching the rosary at his neck. Ramirez's throat closed. It was Mateo. The boy's name tore from Isabella's voice in his mind, the memory of her pleading eyes flooding him as he reached inside with trembling hands. Carefully, he lifted the child, his small body slick and chillingly cold. Water streamed from the case, pooling around Ramirez's boots. Gasps broke through the crowd like waves. Mothers in the group cried out. Fathers pressed hands to their mouths. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight, but others leaned closer, as if by sheer force of will they could pour life back into the boy's frail frame. "Está vivo!" Ramirez cried, pressing 2 fingers against Mateo's neck. Faint, so faint, but there it was, a pulse, fragile as a bird's wing. The crowd erupted in chaotic motion. Someone shouted for paramedics. Another sprinted toward the road where an ambulance had been stationed since the night before. A fisherman tore off his jacket, spreading it on the ground for Ramirez to lay the child upon. Bravo whined and pressed close, his nose nudging Mateo's small hand as if urging him not to let go. The boy's fingers twitched faintly in response, and a ripple of awe moved through those who saw it. "Hold on, pequeño. Hold on," Ramirez whispered, his voice cracking. He began working quickly, loosening the ropes, rubbing Mateo's arms to stir warmth into the lifeless skin. The child's chest rose weakly, a shallow wheeze escaping his lips. The paramedics arrived, pushing through the crowd with urgency. Their kits snapped open, oxygen masks hissing to life. Ramirez stepped back, only when the medics placed the mask over Mateo's face, securing his tiny body with practiced hands. He stood frozen, chest heaving, watching as they worked, every instinct screaming to help, though he knew the boy was safer in their care. The crowd had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by the rapid commands of the medics. One woman wept openly, clutching her daughter to her chest. Another man whispered prayers under his breath, repeating the same phrase again and again. "El milagro está aquí." The miracle is here. Ramirez glanced down at Bravo. The dog sat now, soaked to the skin, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Yet his eyes never wavered from the boy. There was something in those eyes, Ramirez thought, that humans struggled to hold on to. An unyielding belief that even in the darkest places, life could still be pulled back into the light. "Who could do this?" a fisherman muttered, his voice shaking with both rage and fear. "To bind a child, to throw him into the river like nothing." Ramirez had no answer. He could only watch as the medics lifted Mateo gently, carrying him toward the waiting ambulance. The boy's head lolled against their arms, the mask fogging faintly with each fragile breath. The crowd parted in reverent silence, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers clenched their fists at their sides, and through it all, Bravo trotted behind the stretcher, refusing to let the boy out of his sight. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, and its siren wailed into the morning, Ramirez stood rooted to the ground, the weight of what they had found pressing into him. He knew this was only the beginning. The river had given up one secret, but in its depths and in the shadows of Santa Aurora, darker truths still waited. But for now, he let himself cling to one fragile, staggering fact. Mateo was alive. Against all odds, against the cruelty of those who had taken him, the boy still drew breath. And it was Bravo, brave, relentless Bravo, who had dragged him back from the river's grip. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the dawn, shattering the fragile quiet of Santa Aurora. The narrow streets trembled under the sound as the vehicle sped toward the regional hospital, its red lights flashing across shuttered windows and stone walls. Inside, Mateo Cruz lay small and still upon the stretcher, his chest rising in shallow, uncertain breaths beneath the hiss of the oxygen mask. His skin was ghostly pale, water still seeping from his soaked clothing, his little body shivering, though wrapped in blankets. The paramedics worked with practiced precision, their voices clipped and urgent. Pressure dropping. Keep that mask steady. Pulse is weak, but holding. Let's get fluids ready. Every second mattered. Every bump in the road another battle between life and the river's memory. At the rear doors, pressed against the glass, Officer Javier Ramirez kept his eyes fixed on the child. His knuckles were white from gripping the metal rail, as though sheer will could anchor Mateo to this world. Beside him sat Bravo, dripping wet, his fur plastered against his frame. The shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, his eyes locked on the boy with an intensity that needed no translation. He would not look away, not for a moment. The hospital loomed ahead, its white facade stark against the pink blush of sunrise. Nurses were already waiting at the entrance, alerted by the call. As the ambulance screeched to a halt, the stretcher was pulled out, wheels rattling against the pavement. The medics shouted vital signs, nurses responded, and Mateo disappeared into the fluorescent-lit corridors. Ramirez followed until a nurse raised her hand. Only family beyond this point. He stopped, swallowing hard. He glanced at Bravo, who growled low, resisting the leash. Ramirez crouched, his hand firm on the dog's chest. "We've done our part, amigo. Now let them fight for him." Bravo's body trembled, torn between instinct and obedience, but finally he sat at the doors, eyes never leaving the corridor where Mateo had vanished. Moments later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the tile. Isabella Cruz burst through the hospital doors, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her hair disheveled, her eyes wild with desperation. She had been roused from her vigil at home by the news. Her boy was found, alive. The words had hit her like both salvation and a blow, leaving her running through the streets until her lungs burned. She nearly collapsed at the reception desk. "Mateo, my son, where is he? Please, tell me where." Her voice cracked into sobs that tore at every heart in the room. A nurse caught her trembling shoulders. "He's here. He's alive." "But we must work quickly." Isabella stumbled forward, clutching at the air as if reaching for her boy. She caught sight of the stretcher vanishing through double doors and collapsed to her knees. Her cry filled the hallway, raw and unguarded, a sound that froze even the doctors mid-step. "Mi niño. Dios mío. Mi niño." Ramirez moved to her side, steadying her by the arm. For a moment, she looked at him as though he were a lifeline. Through tears, she whispered, "You found him?" He shook his head softly. "Not me. Bravo." He turned his gaze toward the shepherd, sitting rigid, soaked, his eyes pinned to the emergency doors. Isabella followed his look. Slowly, unsteadily, she crossed to the dog and sank to her knees before him. Bravo leaned forward, his wet muzzle brushing her hand. Isabella clutched his fur, burying her face against him. Her tears soaked into his coat, her sobs muffled in the warmth of the animal that had dragged her son back from death's grip.
Gracias,
she whispered over and over.
gracias.
Bravo remained still, his body a silent pillar, his amber eyes never leaving the doors. Inside the emergency room, doctors battled against time. Tubes and wires were connected, blankets layered over the boy's frail frame. His small body shuddered with every attempt at breath, his lungs still heavy with river water. Clear the airway. Pressure dropping. Push epinephrine. Come on, little one, stay with us. The team worked in rhythm, hearts pounding, sweat on their brows despite the chill of the sterile room. For them, it was another case in a life of emergencies. But even hardened professionals felt the weight of this boy. How small he was, how close he teetered to the edge, how impossible it seemed that he had survived at all. Back in the waiting area, Isabella paced the tiles until her knees gave way. Ramirez guided her to a chair. She clasped her rosary so tightly the beads dug into her palm, whispering prayers in between sobs. Every passing minute stretched unbearably long, every muffled shout from behind the doors a dagger to her heart. Bravo moved in restless arcs across the floor, padding back and forth, his claws tapping against tile. He would pause, nose to the air, ears twitching, then resume pacing. The dog was soaked, shivering slightly, but he refused to rest. Each time the doors swung open for a nurse or doctor, his head shot up, eyes burning with questions only he seemed to understand. The waiting room filled with others, neighbors, friends, townsfolk, who had followed the ambulance on foot, desperate for news. Some placed hands on Isabella's shoulders, whispering comfort. Others watched Ramirez and Bravo with awe, murmuring about the miracle pulled from the river. Yet beneath their whispers lingered something darker. The fear that Mateo's story was not unique, that there were other children, unseen, still in the grip of unseen hands. Hours seemed to pass, though in truth it was far less. At last the doors opened and a doctor stepped out, his expression grave, but not hopeless. He approached Isabella, kneeling so his eyes met hers. "He is alive," the doctor said softly. "We have stabilized him for now. He is very weak, but he is breathing on his own." Isabella crumpled against him in relief, a sob bursting free from her chest. She clutched his arm as though he had delivered salvation himself. Ramirez let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, while Bravo gave a single, low whine, his tail brushing the floor just once. The doctor raised a cautionary hand. "It will be a long recovery. He has been through something terrible. But he is fighting." Isabella pressed trembling hands to her lips, whispering, "Gracias a Dios." She turned to Bravo, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And gracias a ti, valiente." The shepherd tilted his head, silent as stone, but in his eyes burned a truth the entire town would come to remember. Sometimes salvation does not come in words or uniforms, but in the steady, unyielding loyalty of a creature who refuses to let go. And so, as Mateo lay sleeping in the safety of the hospital, the boy's mother clinging to hope by his bedside, Bravo remained outside the door, soaked, pacing, a sentinel carved from flesh and devotion. The hospital room was dim, except for the soft glow of a single lamp above the bed, casting a pale circle of light over the fragile form of Mateo Cruz. The machines beside him pulsed with steady beeps, their rhythms foreign but strangely comforting, a reminder that his heart still fought within his small chest. Tubes and wires trailed across his body, and the oxygen mask rose and fell with each shallow breath. At his side sat Isabella, her body bent forward in a posture of exhaustion and prayer. Her hands, chafed from years of work, clutched the blanket near his tiny fingers, unwilling to let go. She had not moved for hours, except to smooth his damp hair from his forehead, or whisper words only he might hear. Every time her eyes closed, the nightmare replayed in cruel clarity. She saw the yard where he had been chasing the butterfly, and heard the echo of his laughter like bells in the morning air. Then, just as sharply, came the silence, the absence that had ripped through her soul. She remembered running into the street, calling his name until her voice broke. She remembered the looks of pity, the whispers she had tried to block out, the way the world had seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Now, here he was, her son, but altered, broken in a way that made her heart ache. His lips, once quick to smile, were tinged with blue. His little hands were stiff and cold when she tried to warm them between her palms. It felt as though the river had tried to claim him, to drag him into its eternal hush, and only by some miracle had he been pulled back. She leaned close, her lips brushing his temple. "You're here, mi niño. You're still here. Don't let go." Her whisper trembled into the sterile air, joining the endless chorus of prayers uttered in hospitals around the world. Parents begging heaven not to take their children. She thought of the nights after her husband disappeared, when Mateo would climb into her bed and press close, asking if Papa would ever come home. She had lied then, whispering that he was working far away, that one day they would see him again. She had lied because she could not bear to tell her son the truth, that some losses in life were final, and some silences never broke. But losing her husband had taught her one thing. She could survive sorrow. What she could not survive was the absence of her child. Outside the window, dawn was giving way to full morning. The city of Santa Aurora stirred. Horns on the streets, footsteps in the halls, voices rising. Yet inside the small hospital room, time felt suspended. Isabella's world had narrowed to the rise and fall of Mateo's chest, to the fragile pulse beneath his skin. She clasped her rosary, the beads digging into her palm. Her words came low, fervent. "Holy Mother, hear me. I don't ask for riches. I don't ask for peace. I ask only for my son. Let me carry his pain. Let me suffer in his place. But please, do not take him." Her voice broke, and she pressed her forehead to the bed, sobs shaking her shoulders. She was not alone in her grief, though it felt like it. Across the world, countless mothers whispered the same prayers into hospital rooms, into dark bedrooms, into the sky. She was part of a chorus of broken hearts, though at that moment, all she could feel was her own. The door opened softly. Officer Javier Ramirez stepped in, his uniform damp from the river, fatigue etched into his features. Bravo padded quietly beside him, fur still clinging to the smell of water. Ramirez lingered at the doorway, hesitant to intrude. Isabella lifted her head, her eyes red, her voice raw. "He looks so small. How can someone do this to a child?" Ramirez had no answer. He only stepped closer, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "He is alive because he's stronger than anyone thought, and because Bravo would not let him go." The shepherd pressed forward, nose nudging against the edge of the bed, his amber eyes fixed on Mateo as if willing him to wake. Isabella reached out, resting her hand on Bravo's wet coat. The dog leaned into her touch, silent but resolute, a living reminder that hope could come in unexpected forms. She turned back to her son, her voice softening into a lullaby she had sung to him since infancy. Her voice wavered, but the melody carried through the room, a fragile thread binding her to him, pulling him closer from the edge. "Go to sleep, my love. Mama is here." The machines hummed. The river of time moved forward, but Isabella remained where she was, anchored to her son, her prayers rising like smoke, her love unyielding. The world outside could whisper of traffickers and fear, but here in this room, there was only one truth she clung to. Matteo had been given back to her, and she would not let him go again. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the hospital room, a fragile metronome marking the line between silence and survival. Isabella sat slumped in her chair, her hand wrapped around Matteo's tiny fingers, whispering prayers into the soft light of the afternoon. She had not slept. Her body ached, her lips were cracked from thirst, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the rise and fall of her son's chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. Then, almost imperceptibly, his fingers twitched. Isabella froze, her breath caught in her throat. She looked down, hardly daring to hope it wasn't her imagination. Again, the faintest movement, a tiny hand tightening against hers, weak but deliberate. "Matteo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mi amor, can you hear me?" The boy stirred, his eyelids fluttering. His lashes, damp and stuck together, lifted slowly to reveal eyes that seemed disoriented, swimming in the weight of what they had endured. He blinked against the harsh light, confusion clouding his gaze. For a moment, he looked so small, so frightened, that Isabella thought her heart might split in two. "You're safe," she whispered quickly, bending close, her lips brushing his temple. "You're here with Mama. You're safe." A nurse, who had been charting at the corner of the room, hurried forward, her voice hushed but urgent. "Senora Cruz, keep speaking to him. He knows you." She leaned over the boy, checking vitals, adjusting the mask at his face. Matteo's shallow breaths came faster now, as if his body were trying to rejoin a world it had nearly left behind. His lips parted. At first, no sound came, just a faint rasp of air. Isabella leaned even closer, tears streaking her face. "I'm here, hijo. Take your time. Mama is here." Finally, a whisper, fragile as glass. "Mama." The word broke Isabella open. A sob tore from her chest, but she smothered it quickly, not wanting to frighten him. She kissed his cheek again and again, her tears mingling with the dampness of his skin. "Sí, mi vida. I'm here." Dr. Alvarez entered, alerted by the nurse, his expression cautious but attentive. He examined the boy with swift hands, nodding as Matteo's gaze grew steadier. "He is coming back," the doctor murmured. "Slowly, but he is fighting." Matteo's eyes shifted, moving weakly around the room. They stopped suddenly, locking onto a shape near the doorway. "Bravo!" The German shepherd stood as he had all night, patient and watchful, his head tilted, ears pricked forward. When Matteo's gaze found him, a change rippled across the boy's face. His lips trembled, a faint hint of recognition sparking in his tired eyes. "Dog," he whispered hoarsely, his voice so faint Isabella almost missed it. Ramirez, who had been standing silently behind Bravo, stepped forward. "That's right, Matteo. This is Bravo. He's the one who found you." The boy's gaze lingered, fragile and searching. His chest rose and fell, each breath laborious but determined. Then, with effort, his small voice formed the words that would linger in the hearts of everyone who heard them. "I saw the dog's eyes, and I knew I was safe." The room stilled, Even the machines seemed quieter, as though the world itself bowed to the weight of those words. The nurse's hand paused mid-motion. The doctor looked up, his expression softening. Ramirez blinked hard, his jaw tightening as he swallowed emotion. Isabella pressed her forehead against her son's hand, tears falling freely now. Her body shook with sobs, not of despair, but of the overwhelming relief of knowing her boy had seen light, even in the darkest moment. She whispered, "Gracias, Dios mío. Gracias." Bravo stepped forward slowly, his claws clicking softly against the tile. He stopped at the side of the bed, lowering his head so Mateo could see him better. The boy's trembling hand lifted, weak but determined, reaching toward the shepherd. Bravo did not move, did not flinch. He only leaned forward, allowing the boy's fingers to brush against his damp fur. Mateo's eyes closed again, but this time not from fear or exhaustion. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, the first since his return from the river. Ramirez cleared his throat, his voice quiet. "You see, even in the darkness, he knew." The dog gave him something no one else could, a reason to hold on. For Isabella, the moment was holy. Her son, pulled from death's edge, had been anchored not by medicine or chance, but by the gaze of a creature who had refused to let him vanish. She kissed Mateo's hand, her tears falling onto his skin like baptism. The nurse gently adjusted the blankets, whispering to Isabella, "He will need rest." But those words, they are a sign. He is fighting his way back. The room returned to its rhythm, the hum of machines, the soft shuffle of feet. But the air was different now, lighter, charged with the sense that a miracle had been spoken aloud. And through it all, Bravo remained still, his amber eyes never leaving the boy he had saved. The hospital ward was hushed in the late afternoon light, a kind of sacred stillness that settled after the chaos of doctors rushing in and out. Machines hummed with a steady rhythm, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Isabella sat at Mateo's bedside, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead, her thumb tracing gentle circles over his hand. Every time his chest rose, she whispered another prayer of thanks. At the doorway, Officer Javier Ramirez stood with Bravo at his side. The German shepherd's fur was still damp from the river, his frame taut with waiting. All night, and into the day, he had been kept at the threshold, pacing restlessly, his amber eyes locked on the boy who had clung to life. Now, Ramirez exchanged a glance with the nurse on duty. "He's awake enough," the nurse murmured softly. "Let him in. Sometimes. It does more than medicine." Ramirez nodded, bending down to Bravo. "Despacio, viejo." Gently. The dog's ears twitched at his voice, as if he too understood the gravity of this moment. Together, they stepped inside. The sound of Bravo's paws against the tile broke the silence. Mateo's eyelids fluttered at the noise, his gaze shifting weakly toward the doorway. When his eyes landed on the familiar figure, his lips parted, and a faint light returned to his face. "Dog," he whispered, his voice hoarse, but unmistakably filled with recognition. Bravo moved closer, his gait careful, his nose lifted toward the child. When he reached the bedside, he lowered himself, resting his head on the mattress near Mateo's small arm. His breath stirred the sheets, warm and steady. With a trembling effort, Mateo lifted his hand. The movement was fragile, his fingers shaking as though weighed down by the river still clinging to him. Inch by inch, his hand stretched toward Bravo's fur. The shepherd did not move, did not flinch. He simply stayed still, offering himself to the boy's touch. Finally, Matteo's palm found its place against the damp coat. His fingers curled into the thick fur, and a soft sigh escaped him, a sound so faint it was almost a prayer. Isabella's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She had watched her son vanish into silence, watched him pulled half dead from a river, and now she watched him cling to life again, anchored not by words, not by medicine, but by the steady presence of a dog who had carried him back from death's edge. "Gracias," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Gracias, Bravo." Ramirez stood at the foot of the bed, his own eyes burning as he tried to hold himself steady. He had seen his partner find drugs, criminals, even bodies. But this was different. This was a reminder that loyalty and instinct could reach into places beyond the grasp of human hands. Bravo gave a soft whine, pressing his muzzle gently closer to Matteo's arm. The boy smiled faintly, his lips curving in a way Isabella thought she might never see again. He closed his eyes, but this time it was not the collapse of exhaustion. It was rest, safe rest, cradled in the knowledge that the dog who had found him in the darkness now kept guard beside him in the light. Isabella reached across the bed, her hand resting on Bravo's head. Her fingers sank into his damp fur, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt something other than terror. She felt hope, real, breathing, warm hope, resting beneath her hand. In that room, with machines beeping, prayers whispered, and tears falling, a truth took shape. Salvation had come on 4 paws, wrapped in loyalty, carried by eyes that refused to look away. And for Isabella, the realization was overwhelming. Hope had not been lost. Hope had walked into the room, fur damp, eyes steady, and laid its head beside her son. The hospital's corridors were quiet, hushed with the gravity of sickness and survival. Officer Javier Ramirez leaned against the wall just outside Matteo's room, arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing. Inside, Isabella kept her vigil, with Bravo curled at her feet. For a moment, there was peace in knowing the boy still breathed. But peace was fleeting. Ramirez's mind had already begun to turn, restless, circling back to questions he could no longer ignore. This was not the first child. The thought gnawed at him like a stone in his boot. In the years he had worn the uniform of Santa Aurora, he had seen missing children's posters nailed to poles, their photographs fading in the sun and rain until they blended with the wood. Each case had carried the same bitter aftertaste. No resolution. A mother's cries that echoed until they became silent. A father's fists clenched against a wall, whole families hollowed out and left with only rumors. Ramirez closed his eyes, and faces came unbidden. Sofia Marquez, 7 years old, last seen walking home from school. Diego Torres, 9, vanished after running an errand for his grandmother. Lucia Jimenez, barely 6, gone from her yard while her mother hung laundry. He remembered them all, because he had failed to bring them home. Now, as he pieced the pattern together, the similarities struck him like blows. They were always young, under 10, small enough to be overpowered quickly. Their families were always vulnerable, single mothers, grandparents too old to protect them, homes already worn thin by poverty. And always the cases collapsed into silence, brushed aside when the trail ran cold. But not this time. This time, a boy had been found, alive, bound, hidden in a suitcase, dumped like refuse in the river, but alive. And because of that, Ramirez finally had something more than rumors. He had evidence. He had a survivor. He pushed off the wall, pacing slowly down the corridor. His boots struck against the tile in steady rhythm as his thoughts unraveled into a picture darker than any he had dared to believe. If Mateo had been taken in the same way as the others, then the town was not facing random tragedies. It was facing something organized, something deliberate. A ring. The word lodged itself in his chest like a thorn. He had heard whispers before. Traffickers preying on poor towns, selling children across borders where no one would ever think to look for them. He had dismissed it once, hoping the darkness of the world had not seeped so deeply into their small community. But now, after pulling a child from a suitcase in the river, there was no denying it. Ramirez rubbed a hand over his face, the exhaustion of sleepless nights catching up with him. Bravo padded out of the room, his nails clicking softly on the tile. The dog sat at Ramirez's feet, amber eyes lifting to meet his own. There was no doubt in that gaze, no hesitation. Only the same instinct Ramirez had learned to trust. The dog had sensed this truth long before he had spoken it aloud. "You knew, didn't you?" Ramirez murmured, crouching to scratch behind Bravo's ears. "You knew the trail wasn't just about one boy." "It's bigger than that." A nurse walked past, casting a sympathetic glance. Ramirez straightened, forcing his face into the calm mask of a man in control. But inside, his pulse raced. If there was a network operating here, every second Mateo lay in that hospital bed was a second borrowed against time. The ones responsible would know they had failed, and men like that did not leave loose ends. He returned to his small office at the station later that evening, pulling open dusty files stacked in forgotten drawers. The air smelled of paper and ink, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan overhead. He spread the case reports across his desk, scribbled notes in the margins, circled dates and names. The pattern grew sharper with every page. The disappearances always fell near the same stretch of river, the same districts where poverty clung tightest. No suspects had ever been firmly identified, but in the margins of several reports one name surfaced. Luis Ortega, a man once questioned and released. His name was tied to rumors of smuggling, petty crimes, and debts to men with far greater power. Ramirez stared at it, his jaw tightening. He whispered to himself, "This is no coincidence." Bravo whined softly at his side, resting his head against Ramirez's knee. Ramirez reached down, his hand brushing through the shepherd's fur, grounding himself. For years he had carried the weight of unanswered questions, of mothers who never stopped asking. Now, finally, he felt the tremor of an answer. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had taken Mateo had ties to the others. This was not the cruelty of chance. It was the machinery of a system, a ring feeding on the most vulnerable. Ramirez closed the file, his voice low but certain. "We're going to find them, Bravo." "All of them." The dog's ears pricked, his gaze sharp, as if he, too, understood the vow. For the first time in years, Ramirez felt that the shadows could be pierced, and he would not stop, not now, not ever, until every child stolen from Santa Aurora was accounted for, and the men who had built their empire on fear were dragged into the light. The hospital had a room tucked away from the busy corridors, its walls painted in soft blues, shelves lined with worn toys and picture books. It was meant to feel less like a ward and more like a safe corner of the world. though nothing could fully disguise the weight of what happened there. This was where children were asked to remember what no child should have to. Matteo sat on a small chair, legs dangling, his frame still too frail from the days in the river. The oxygen mask had been removed, leaving a faint outline against his skin. His eyes looked older than they had before, haunted, though too young to carry the things that haunted them. Isabella sat nearby, her hands clasped so tightly around her rosary that the beads left imprints in her skin. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not when her son needed her steady. Across from Matteo sat Dr. Valeria Montoya, a child psychologist brought in from the city. Her voice was calm, warm, carrying the steady cadence of someone who knew children, often spoke in pieces, never in order. She held a small stuffed bear and slid it across the table. "This is Bruno. He's here to listen. You don't have to tell me everything at once, Matteo. Just little by little, the way you remember." The boy's fingers curled around the toy, his gaze downcast. His lips trembled before words found their way out. "It was dark." Valeria nodded gently. "Dark. Can you tell me more?" Matteo's voice was fragile, a whisper more than sound. "I was playing. Then someone put their hand." He pressed his small fingers over his mouth and nose, showing more than he could speak. "And then I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe." Isabella's breath shuddered. She pressed the rosary harder against her lips to keep from crying out. Ramirez, who stood near the doorway with Bravo sitting at his side, clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. "The dark," Valeria prompted softly. "Where were you when it was dark?" Matteo's brow furrowed. "It smelled bad. Like the car when Papa used to fix it. Oil." His tiny hands mimicked a box around him. "I was inside. It was moving. And there were voices." Valeria leaned forward slightly. "Voices. Do you remember what they sounded like?" Matteo nodded, his eyes squeezing shut. "One was rough. Low. He said, 'Hurry.' The other—" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the stuffed bear. "The other said, 'Don't let him cry. Someone will hear.'" The room was heavy with silence. Valeria kept her voice steady. "You did so well, Matteo. Very brave. Do you remember anything about the men?" For a long moment, he was still. Then he lifted one trembling hand to his cheek, dragging his finger down from temple to jaw. He had a line. Here. Ramirez's eyes sharpened. A scar. His mind flickered back to the files, to the name he had circled. Luis Ortega. A man described once in passing as having a scar across his face. "A line on his face," Valeria repeated softly, affirming the boy's memory. "You're helping us so much, Matteo." The child's eyes watered, his voice breaking. "The house." He swallowed hard. It smelled strong, like fire, like when Mama makes Papa's lamp and it spills. "Gasoline?" Valeria asked gently. Matteo nodded, clutching the bear to his chest. "I don't like it. I don't want to go back." Isabella could not stay still any longer. She pulled him into her arms, rocking him, her tears finally breaking free. "Nunca más, mi vida. Never again. You'll never go back." "Mama's here." Ramirez stepped forward, his face grim. He crouched down, Bravo close at his knee, and let the boy meet his gaze. "Matteo," he said softly, You were so brave. Because you told us this. We can find the bad men. And we will. They won't hurt you again. Or anyone else. The boy's eyes drifted toward Bravo. Slowly, shakily, he reached out a hand. The shepherd pressed his muzzle into the boy's palm, steady and warm. Mateo whispered, "He found me. He saved me." Ramirez swallowed the tightness in his throat. He thought of the unsolved cases, the faded photographs, the names whispered in grief. Now, because of a boy's fragments, voices, a scar, the smell of gasoline, they had a path forward. It was not enough yet, but it was something. A thread in the dark, and Bravo, ever faithful, would follow it until it led them to the truth. The river carried its usual hush that morning, the kind that masked secrets beneath the current. But for Officer Javier Ramirez, there was no peace in its sound. He stood once more at the muddy bank where Bravo had dragged the suitcase ashore, staring at the place where the nightmare had revealed itself. The ground still bore the marks of boots and frantic hands from that day, the soil gouged deep by Bravo's claws. Now the German shepherd stood rigid, nose to the breeze, tail stiff like a flag in warning. His chest rose and fell quickly, breath sharp as he tested the air. Ramirez tightened his grip on the leash, though experience told him he would not hold Bravo back for long. "All right, viejo," he muttered. "Show me." 2 other officers flanked him, their eyes wary. None spoke much. The weight of Mateo's fragments, the scar, the smell of gasoline, hung heavy over them. They knew they weren't looking for driftwood or stray trash today. They were looking for a trail. Bravo lowered his nose to the soil, sniffing in tight, deliberate circles. He let out a low whine, then surged forward. Ramirez followed, boots sinking into damp earth. The shepherd moved with precision, nose sweeping from left to right, then locking onto a line invisible to human eyes. "Where's he taking us?" one officer asked. Ramirez didn't answer. He trusted the dog more than he trusted his own instincts. Bravo pulled them away from the open water, toward a cluster of abandoned docks where warehouses slumped like tired giants against the horizon. The air grew heavier there, tinged with rust and something acrid, oil perhaps, or gasoline. When they reached the first warehouse, its corrugated metal side scarred with rust, Bravo stopped. His ears pricked, nose working furiously. Then he barked, sharp and insistent, pawing at the ground near the loading bay door. Ramirez motioned for the officers to circle around. He pressed his hand to the cool metal, listening. Only silence inside. With effort, they pried open a side door, the hinges groaning in protest. Dust rose in clouds as they stepped into the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with neglect. Broken pallets littered the floor. Cobwebs draped the corners, and the faint, sour stench of gasoline clung to the shadows. Bravo padded ahead, his nails clicking against the concrete, nose dragging low. Suddenly, he stopped and let out a growl deep in his throat. Ramirez's flashlight beam followed, landing on a corner where refuse had gathered. At first it looked like nothing, just scraps, discarded like so much else. But when Ramirez stepped closer, the sight tightened his chest. A tiny shoe, no bigger than his palm, lay half buried under a torn tarp. Beside it, a strip of duct tape curled, edges frayed, and a length of coarse rope stiff with knots. The other officers went still. Ramirez crouched, lifting the shoe carefully in his gloved hand. It was scuffed, worn at the toes, the kind a child might have worn to school. He turned it over, imagining the small foot that had filled it, the child who had been led, or dragged, into this place. "Holy God," one officer whispered. "They've been here." Bravo pawed at the rope, teeth baring, a low growl vibrating from his chest. His body trembled with urgency, the need to keep searching, to follow the trail wherever it led. Ramirez rose, his voice flat but burning with restrained fury. This is it. This is where they've brought them. The officers exchanged grim glances. The weight of it pressed heavy in the silence, confirmation of what the town had feared, but never dared speak aloud. Children had been taken here, bound here. The evidence lay in scraps of rope and shoes too small to belong to anyone but the missing. Ramirez looked at Bravo, who sat now with ears forward, gaze locked on him. It was as if the dog demanded action, demanded he not let this evidence fade into another unsolved file. Ramirez crouched, resting a hand on the shepherd's head. "You did it, viejo," he murmured. "You've shown us where the shadows live." He straightened, his voice sharper now, carrying the authority of a man with purpose. "We seal this place. We bring forensics. Every inch gets combed. This isn't just about Mateo anymore. This is about all of them." The officers nodded, their faces grim. Outside, the river continued its endless flow, indifferent to the pain it had carried. But here, inside the abandoned shell of the warehouse, Ramirez felt something shift. The shadows had been marked, dragged into light by the instincts of a dog who refused to stop. And for the first time in years, Ramirez felt not only rage, but resolve. The ring was real, and now, thanks to Bravo, they had proof. The night pressed down heavy over Santa Aurora, the river whispering low in the distance like it carried secrets only the brave dared follow. Clouds moved slow across the moon, casting shifting shadows over the abandoned docks. It was there, in the shell of the old warehouse Bravo had marked, that the police gathered in silence. Officer Javier Ramirez stood at the front, his jaw set, eyes scanning the corrugated walls that loomed against the sky. He felt the weight of every case file that had lain unsolved in his office, every mother's tears, every unanswered question. Tonight, he carried those voices with him. Tonight, there would be no more silence. Beside him, Bravo crouched low, muscles taut, ears pricked for the smallest sound. The shepherd's amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, steady, alert. Ramirez rested a hand briefly on his back. "One more time, viejo. Show us the truth." The strike team moved into position, their boots silent against the cracked concrete. Flashlights flicked on, beams cutting through the dark. With a signal from Ramirez, the battering ram slammed into the side door. The sound thundered across the docks, metal shrieking as the door caved inward. "Police, hands up!" Voices roared into the hollow space as officers surged inside. The warehouse swallowed their shouts, its vast emptiness echoing. Flashlight beams swept across dust, broken pallets, rusted machinery. The air smelled of gasoline and mold, the heavy staleness of a place that had been used and abandoned. Empty. For a heartbeat, it seemed they had come too late, chasing only shadows. But then Bravo pulled forward, nose to the ground, growling low in his throat. Ramirez followed, beam cutting across the far wall, and froze. Photographs. Dozens of them, pinned in neat rows across the corrugated metal. Faces of children stared back at them, printed on cheap paper, some grainy and faded, others sharp as if taken just days ago. Boys and girls, all under 10. Some smiling in school portraits, others captured candidly in streets or doorways. Gasps broke the silence. One officer cursed under his breath, another whispered a prayer. Ramirez's eyes burned as he stepped closer, lifting a trembling hand to the wall. His fingers brushed across the faces, stopping when they landed on one he knew too well. Mateo, the boy's school photo, smiling with hair slightly crooked from Isabella's hurried hand that morning. The sight of it here, on this wall of stolen innocence, made Ramirez's stomach twist with rage. He turned, voice rough. "This is no random crime. This is organized, catalogued. They're hunting them." The other officers spread out, beams searching every corner. A table sat near the center of the room, littered with scraps, duct tape, rope, syringes still in their wrappers. A ledger lay half open, filled with numbers and initials no one could yet decode. One young officer lifted a photograph from the floor, his hands shaking. "My God. I know this girl. She disappeared last year in San Miguel." His voice cracked. "They had her picture here all along." Ramirez's chest heaved as fury welled inside him. Every rumor the townsfolk had whispered, every warning ignored, every child written off as lost. It had all led here. This place was not a warehouse. It was a hunting ground, a storage of lives reduced to paper. Bravo barked suddenly, his body rigid, pulling Ramirez toward a corner hidden behind a stack of crates. The officers rushed over, forcing the wood aside. Behind it was a small door, padlocked. With a crowbar, they broke it open, the lock clattering to the ground. The narrow room inside was worse than any of them had braced for. Small mattresses lined the floor, stained and thin. Empty water bottles and food wrappers littered the corners. The walls bore scratches, faint but unmistakable. Tiny fingernails dragged against wood. Silence fell, heavy and unbearable. One officer whispered hoarsely, "They kept them here." Ramirez felt his throat close. He bent down, running his fingers over the grooves in the wall, imagining small hands scraping for freedom. He had thought himself hardened to horror, but this was beyond anything his uniform could shield him from. He looked at Bravo, who sat at his side, ears back, eyes fixed on the emptiness of the room. The dog gave a low whine, as if mourning the lives that had passed through here, unseen and unheard. Ramirez rose, his voice breaking the silence. "Photograph everything. Bag every piece of evidence. This is how we bring them down. No more whispers. No more unsolved files. We have proof now." The officers moved quickly, snapping pictures, gathering items into bags. But as they worked, the rage lingered. The photographs on the wall stared back at them. Dozens of children whose fates were still unknown. For everyone saved, how many more were still out there? Ramirez clenched his fists, eyes narrowing. The men who had built this, who had dared use children like cargo, were not ghosts. They were flesh and blood. And he would not rest until every one of them stood exposed under the weight of justice. Behind him, Bravo sat tall, silent, his amber gaze locked on the photographs. It was as though he, too, understood the promise being made at that moment. The river had given up one secret. Now the walls had revealed another. The trail was no longer whispering. It was carved in rope, in duct tape, in faces pinned to cold steel. And Ramirez swore he would follow it to the end. The night after the raid, Santa Aurora did not sleep. Word of what had been found in the warehouse spread faster than wildfire, whispered from doorstep to doorstep, carried into kitchens and across plazas. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers stood in doorways with eyes like flint. For years they had lived with rumors, but now there was proof. In the police station, Officer Javier Ramirez sat with the photographs spread across the desk before him. The children's faces stared back, Dozens of them, Mateo among them. His chest tightened with each glance. He could feel Bravo pacing behind him, the dog restless, unwilling to settle, even after hours of duty. Ramirez reached out and touched the shepherd's head. "We'll find them," he whispered. "Every single one." And to do that, they had to find Luis Ortega. They tracked him down by dawn. Ortega had been hiding in a rundown boarding house near the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place where men vanished into shadows and no one asked questions. Ramirez led the unit himself. Boots echoed up the stairwell as officers spread through the building, flashlights slashing across peeling wallpaper and doors swollen by humidity. Bravo strained against his leash, nose sharp to the trail. When they reached room 6, the shepherd let out a growl so low and deep it rattled through Ramirez's bones. With a nod, the officers kicked the door open. Inside, Ortega froze mid-step, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He was older than Ramirez expected, his face weathered, but the scar was unmistakable, a jagged line running from temple to jaw, like a cruel reminder carved into flesh. His eyes darted, calculating, but he raised his hands quickly when the officers leveled their guns. "Luis Ortega," Ramirez barked, "you are under arrest." Ortega sneered. "For what? Sitting in my own room?" Bravo lunged forward, teeth bared, his growl reverberating through the small space. Ortega flinched despite himself, his bravado cracking for an instant. Ramirez pulled the leash tight, but let the shepherd stand close, his presence deliberate. "You know why," Ramirez said coldly. "The warehouse, the children, their photographs are on your wall." "I don't know anything about that," Ortega spat, though sweat beaded along his brow. "I've been here for weeks. Ask anyone." "Liar," one officer muttered, securing his wrists in cuffs. Ramirez stepped closer, his voice low, each word deliberate. "A boy survived, Ortega. He saw you. He remembered your scar." For a split second, Ortega's mask faltered. His eyes narrowed, darting to Bravo, whose growl deepened as if he could smell the fear leaking from the man's skin. Ramirez watched the twitch at Ortega's jaw, the tremor of his hands. The denial was breaking. "Talk," Ramirez pressed, "because the only thing standing between you and the rest of your miserable life rotting in a cell is the truth you're holding back. Who's behind this? Who funds it?" Ortega laughed then, a brittle, empty sound. "You think I'm the one pulling strings? I'm nothing. Just a man trying to get by." Ramirez slammed a file onto the table. The ledger from the warehouse, pages marked with initials and payments. "These aren't the books of a man just getting by. These are transactions, and we've already connected them to you." One of the officers entered with a small box recovered from Ortega's room. Inside were documents, receipts, bank slips, correspondence, names, numbers, and most damning of all, letters signed by Esteban Calderon, a wealthy businessman known publicly for his philanthropy. Ramirez's blood ran hot as he read the signature. Calderon had been a benefactor at community events, shaking hands, handing out money like gifts. But here was his name, tied directly to the purchase and movement of children like cargo. Ramirez turned the paper toward Ortega. "This is who you answer to." Ortega's smirk faltered again. Bravo barked sharply, lunging forward until his teeth were inches from the man's face. Ortega recoiled, panic flashing in his eyes. "All right," he shouted, stumbling back though his hands were bound. "Yes, Calderon pays. He pays for the houses, for the trucks. I don't know everything, but he's the one who makes it possible." The room fell silent, the weight of the confession pressing down. Ramirez straightened slowly, his voice steady, though rage burned beneath. "Then you've just given us the link we needed." Bravo eased back, though his eyes never left Ortega. The dog stood tall, chest heaving, as though he too understood the significance of what had been said. Ramirez leaned close, his words sharp as a blade. "Men like you always think fear will protect you, but look at him." He nodded toward Bravo. "That dog dragged a boy back from the river you thought would hide him. Do you really think your secrets will survive?" Ortega looked away, his silence more damning than any words. As the officers hauled him out, Ramirez stood at the doorway, the night air cool against his face. He looked down at Bravo, who sat at his side, calm now, but alert. "You did it again, old," he murmured, hand brushing over the shepherd's head. "Piece by piece, we're tearing it open." And in that moment, Ramirez knew this was no longer about one boy, or even one town. The shadows stretched wider, reaching into power and wealth. But thanks to Bravo's unrelenting instincts, they finally had a name. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft hum of machines and the gentle rhythm of Mateo's breathing. Isabella sat at his side, her fingers brushing absently over his hand, grounding herself in the fragile proof that he was alive. Each rise of his chest was a miracle, yet her heart could not rest. She had begun to notice the way the nurses looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching, the hesitation in their voices when they stepped just outside the door. By late afternoon, the truth reached her. A neighbor came, clutching a folded newspaper, her eyes wide with pity. She lingered at the doorway before placing it gently in Isabella's lap. "You need to see this," she whispered, and left before questions could follow. Isabella unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The headline screamed in black letters, "Police uncover evidence of child trafficking network." Beneath it, a smaller line that made her vision blur. Dozens of children still missing. Her breath caught. She pressed her palm against her mouth, willing herself not to cry out and wake Mateo. The article detailed the photographs found in the warehouse. Children pinned like trophies to a cold wall. Names she didn't know. Faces she would never forget, now that they were burned into print. And there, among them, the name of her son, listed as one of the targets recovered. The words cut deeper than any wound. Mateo hadn't just been unlucky. He hadn't been a single stolen child. He had been one among many. Her rosary slipped from her lap, beads scattering across the tile. She bent to gather them, but her hands shook so violently she could hardly hold the cord together. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and hot. For a moment she thought she might break apart entirely. Mateo stirred faintly, his small hand tightening around her fingers, even in sleep. The simple gesture pulled her back from the edge. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve, whispering, "I'm here, mi amor. Mama is here." But inside, a storm gathered. Isabella realized she could not stay silent, not anymore. The truth was larger than her family, larger even than her son. There were mothers tonight, rocking empty cradles, fathers staring at doors that would never open again. Families still living the nightmare she had just barely escaped. The thought sickened her. What if Mateo's survival had been the only reason the police uncovered this ring? What if without him, the others would have remained ghosts, swallowed by silence? She looked down at him, his fragile face, the faint bruise at his wrist where rope had cut into tender skin, and something hardened in her chest. She could no longer just be a mother praying in the dark. She had to become a voice, even if it trembled, even if it painted a target on her back. That night, when Ramirez came to check on them, she stopped him at the door. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "I need to speak. To everyone. Not just the police. Not just the town. Everyone." Ramirez frowned. "Isabella, it's dangerous. These men, you've seen what they're capable of. Speaking out could put you in their sights." She shook her head fiercely, tears flashing in her eyes. "They already took my son. They already tried to destroy me. What more can they do? If I stay silent, then the other mothers remain alone. If I speak, maybe the world will look at us. Maybe they'll finally see." Ramirez looked at her for a long moment, then at Bravo, who stood at her side like a sentinel. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in women who refused to let grief bury them. Finally, he nodded. "Then we'll make sure you're not alone when you speak." When he left, Isabella returned to her son's bedside, kneeling until her face was level with his. She kissed his small hand, whispering a vow only he could hear. "I will fight for you, Mateo, and for every child still lost in the dark. They will not be forgotten." Her tears fell onto the blanket, but this time they were not only tears of sorrow. They were the first drops of something fiercer, something unyielding. In that quiet hospital room, with Bravo keeping watch and Mateo breathing softly against the storm of memory, Isabella Cruz became more than a grieving mother. She became a voice rising out of the shadows, ready to name the darkness, even if it cost her everything. The plaza of Santa Aurora had always been ordinary. Fruit stalls spilling into baskets, children chasing pigeons, old men playing cards beneath jacaranda trees. But that night, it transformed. Lanterns flickered in the dusk as families gathered, carrying photographs of children gone for years, candles trembling in their hands, or nothing but the weight of absence. At the center stood a makeshift platform. Officer Ramirez waited with Bravo, the German shepherd sitting tall, amber eyes scanning the restless crowd. Their grief and questions. Who took them? Will they ever come back? Hung heavy in the air. Then Isabella Cruz appeared, clutching her son Mateo, weak but alive. The crowd parted in silence. Mothers stared with tears or clenched jaws, seeing in Mateo what they longed for, a child returned. When Isabella reached the platform, Ramirez steadied her. She faced the sea of faces, lanterns painting her tear-streaked cheeks gold. "My son was taken from me," she said, voice cracking yet clear. "I thought his laughter was gone forever. But I was wrong, because there are dozens still missing. Dozens of mothers who do not sleep." A murmur surged through the crowd. Isabella's voice grew stronger. "They told me to stay silent. They told me it was dangerous. But if we remain quiet, they win. Our children vanish forever. If we stand together, maybe we can bring them home." She lifted Mateo. His tired eyes blinked at the light. Alive. The sight broke the crowd. A sob tore through the night, candles raised high. Isabella's final words trembled but unyielding. "I speak not only for my son, but for every child whose bed lies empty tonight." Together, we are louder than their shadows. The plaza erupted, tears, shouts, fists raised. For the first time in years, Santa Aurora did not whisper. They demanded. Ramirez's throat tightened as Bravo pressed against his leg, sensing the shift, the sorrow hardening into resolve. By morning, the plaza was flooded with cameras, satellite trucks, and reporters. Santa Aurora, once ignored, had become the center of the nation's gaze. Isabella, weary, spoke little. Her presence, arms wrapped around Mateo, eyes red but resolute, spoke louder than answers. It was Bravo who captured the world. In the hospital courtyard, a photographer snapped the image of Mateo's trembling hand, resting in the shepherd's thick coat. Within hours, the photo spread across Argentina, the dog who dragged hope from the river. News anchors repeated the phrase. Social media lit with comments. This is loyalty. A miracle on 4 paws. A mural appeared in Buenos Aires. Bravo painted in black and gold, beneath the words, Lealtad que salva, loyalty that saves. Ramirez, asked by reporters, spoke plainly. Without Bravo, Mateo would not be here. He dragged a suitcase from the river when we expected death, and inside, he gave us life. Cameras caught Bravo lifting his head at his name, amber eyes sharp, ears forward. For a breath, silence. Then, families across the nation saw not only Santa Aurora's grief, but their own reflected in his gaze. Days later, the courthouse steps overflowed. Prosecutor Emilia Vargas addressed the nation. What was uncovered is undeniable. We have evidence of a network that stole children from our streets. We have names, faces, and now, we have a duty. Today, I announce the formation of a national task force dedicated to dismantling this ring. We will not stop until every child is accounted for, and every man who profited stands in chains. Her words thundered. Cries of "Justicia" rose. Then from the crowd, Bravo barked. Deep, steady, rolling across the plaza. Silence fell. Then chanting swelled. Bravo! 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 Cameras swung toward the shepherd, sitting tall, amber eyes steady under the lights. Candles lifted, photographs raised, voices roared until Bravo's name became a promise. Ramirez glanced down, whispering, "Looks like you've become their symbol, viejo." Vargas did not resist the moment. She lifted her hand. Then let Bravo stand as our reminder. Every day we search, let us remember him, the dog who dragged hope from the water and proved no child should ever be forgotten. The crowd erupted, tears streaming, rage and relief entwined. Bravo was no longer just a police dog. He was a banner, a living emblem that the shadows would not win. At the edge of the crowd, Isabella held Mateo. The boy whispered, "My dog." She kissed his hair. "Yes, mi amor. He is yours too. He belongs to all of us now." And as chants of Bravo rolled into the night, Ramirez knew his partner did not understand symbols or headlines. For Bravo, there was only the trail, the scent, the work still unfinished. But for the people of Santa Aurora, and for Argentina, he had become something greater. Proof that loyalty can outlast fear, that courage can be relentless, that hope can rise from a river's depths and blaze against the night. The warehouse raid had lit a fire under the investigation, but Ramirez knew the battle had only begun. For every scrap of evidence uncovered, powerful men in dark suits hid behind walls of protection. To tear them down, they needed proof even officials could not deny. That was how Javier Ramirez, once a clean-handed officer, found himself in a dim cantina disguised as a buyer. His collar unbuttoned, face unshaven, eyes shadowed. He looked the part of a man dealing in darkness. Beneath the table, Bravo lay silent, ears tuned to every word, body coiled like a spring. A trafficker slid into the booth, suspicion in his eyes. "You came recommended. Said you have money." "Money's not the problem," Ramirez replied coolly. "Trust is." The man slid a paper across the table, a list of children's initials and prices. Ramirez's stomach knotted, but his face betrayed nothing. "They're young," the man smirked. "Easier to mold. Officials protect us. Politicians, judges, people you see on TV. That's why you're safe." Under the table, Bravo brushed Ramirez's boot. "Truth." Ramirez leaned closer. "Then prove it." The man produced photographs, grainy images of children herded into vans, men in suits trading briefcases. One face Ramirez recognized instantly. Esteban Calderon, the celebrated philanthropist. Fury surged inside him, but he only nodded. "That's all I needed." As he left, Bravo pressed tight against his leg. Outside, Ramirez slipped a recorder from his pocket. Every boast was captured. "We've got them, viejo," he whispered. "Now the world will hear." 3 nights later, Ramirez sat inside a surveillance van outside Calderon's estate. Monitors flickered with drone footage. High stone walls, armed guards, motion sensors. To the public, Calderon was a saint. To Ramirez, he was a predator in a fortress. "Feed from drone 2, a tech whispered. The screen showed SUVs rolling into a garage. Guards stepped out. Then, children, thin, pale, terrified, herded into a guest house with reinforced doors and barred windows. Bravo growled low, vibrating through Ramirez's boots. Another feed showed Calderon in his study, sipping wine with a man in a navy suit. "The officials expect results," Calderon said, his voice calm. "Their silence is bought with satisfaction." The man chuckled. "And if one goes missing?" "Accidents happen. Police chase ghosts. That's the beauty of owning the system. You can bury anything." Silence filled the van. Flores, a young detective, whispered, "This isn't just Calderon. It's half the city." Ramirez's chest burned, but he kept his voice steady. "Record everything. Every angle." By dawn, they had evidence of a conspiracy reaching judges, senators, even police commanders. But with proof came peril. Ramirez rubbed Bravo's ears. "They'll try to bury this, but you and I will drag it into the light." That night, Ramirez walked into a warehouse under disguise again, Bravo padding silently at his side. Bare bulbs swayed above crates. Armed men loitered. At a long table sat Vargas, Calderon's lieutenant. "You're late," Vargas snapped. "Business doesn't wait," Ramirez replied with a smirk. A guard handed Vargas a folder, ledgers, contracts, names tying Calderon's charities to offshore accounts. The smoking gun. "Payment first," Vargas demanded. Ramirez slid a briefcase of marked bills across the table. Vargas checked, satisfied, and pushed the folder toward him. Ramirez's fingers brushed it when a guard stepped forward. "I've seen him before," the man growled. "He's no buyer." The room froze. Hands slid to weapons. Ramirez forced a laugh. "Maybe I owe you money." The guard advanced, suspicion boiling. Then Bravo barked. Sharp, precise, not frantic. He lunged toward a shadow by the crates, drawing every gun in the room toward the darkness. Ramirez moved instantly, slipping the folder under his jacket, tapping Bravo's leash twice. The shepherd stilled, sitting as if nothing had happened. "Stupid animal," Vargas muttered. The moment passed. Vargas waved the guard off. "If he's lying, we'll know." Let him go. Ramirez turned coldly. Next time, train your men better. He walked out with Bravo at his side, every step like crossing a minefield. Only 3 blocks away did he breathe. In an alley, he opened the folder under a streetlight. Offshore accounts, inventories of children, payments from senators, judges, police chiefs. The conspiracy wasn't deep. It was suffocating. He buried his face in his hands, then looked at Bravo, steady and watchful. You saved me there. You knew when to bark. Bravo pressed his head against Ramirez's knee. The warmth anchored him. Ramirez tucked the folder inside his jacket, his eyes hardening. This is the nail in Calderon's coffin, but it means they'll hunt us now. Bravo gave a quiet whine, eyes fixed on the street, as if already anticipating the next fight. Together, they stepped out of the alley into the neon-lit night. Ramirez knew he carried more than evidence. He carried lives. And he wasn't walking alone. Bravo would be there, dragging hope from shadows, barking at danger before it struck, guiding him through the darkness until justice stood where corruption once reigned. Dawn had barely stretched across Santa Aurora when the city moved with tense urgency. Police vehicles slid into position around Calderon's safe houses. Inside the lead SUV, Ramirez checked his gear. The folder pulled from Calderon's network had changed everything. Now the task force had names, accounts, and locations. Beside him, Bravo sat alert, amber eyes fixed forward. Ramirez whispered, "Remember your signals." The shepherd didn't need reminding. Every bark, every nudge meant more than a radio ever could. At the first safe house, Bravo leapt to the asphalt, nose low. The ram shattered the door. Inside, overturned furniture and shadows told a story of panic too late. Bravo darted between crates, growl low. Then, children's cries. Officers converged on a hidden closet. 2 children, no older than 8, huddled inside, faces streaked with tears. One reached for Bravo. He nudged her gently, tail wagging, and she clung to him as if to life itself. Moments later, Bravo pawed at a false wall. Officers pried it open to reveal a boy coughing in the dark. Bravo licked his hand, grounding him with quiet certainty. Across the city, other units reported similar finds. Basements, attics, locked rooms. The task force moved like a wave, dragging children from the shadows. At one fortified site, Bravo guided Ramirez to a crawl space. 3 children stared with hollow eyes, whispering, "Are we free?" Ramirez nodded. Yes, thanks to him. Bravo rested his head on a girl's lap, tail swaying. By midday, dozens had been rescued. Parents waited outside, rushing forward as vans arrived. Mothers wept into their children's hair. Fathers knelt in disbelief. The air became a chorus of sobs, gasps, and whispers. "You're safe now. I've got you." Bravo remained steady at Ramirez's side, watchful even amid joy. That evening, in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and broth, Mateo sat propped on pillows, clutching a blanket. Bravo lay curled near the bed, refusing to leave since the rescue. Nurses whispered how the dog seemed to know when the boy needed comfort. Detective Ramirez stood by the window, notes in hand. Calderon's empire wasn't finished. Too many names remained. Then, Mateo spoke. He used to sing, the boy whispered. Ramirez knelt. "What do you mean, mijo?" "One of the men. When he locked us in, he sang a lullaby. Mateo hesitated, then hummed a shaky melody. Bravo's ears pricked, eyes fixed on the child. Ramirez's chest tightened. He recognized it. Not a nursery rhyme, but a coastal folk song from San Paloma, far from Santa Aurora, but within Calderon's sphere. He placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. That song tells us where to look next. Hours later, the task force gathered around a map. The lullaby is regional, Ramirez explained. Analysts cross-referenced Calderon's holdings. A beachside villa near San Paloma emerged, registered to a shell company. Without Mateo's detail, it would have stayed hidden. Back at the hospital, Mateo traced circles in Bravo's fur. "He listens," he whispered. For the first time, he smiled. Fragile, but real. When Ramirez returned with news, he crouched by the bed. "Because of you, we found another place. More children will be safe." "Me?" Mateo whispered. "Yes. You remembered something no one else could." Bravo wagged his tail as if confirming. Pride lit Mateo's eyes. That night, he hummed the lullaby again, not with fear, but defiance. It had become a key to freedom. By sunset, the Civic Center steps overflowed with trembling parents and wide-eyed children. Vans had rolled through the city all day. Each arrival met with gasps and sobs. The first reunion was almost unbearable to watch. A mother collapsing as her son flung himself into her arms, their cries stitching broken time back together. Then, like a flood, reunions followed. Some children called names hoarsely, others were too stunned to speak. Parents clutched them, whispering, "I'll never let go." Bravo lay near the steps, chest low to the ground, amber eyes scanning. Exhausted but vigilant, his tail brushed the stones slowly, almost reverently, as if he too understood the sacredness of the moment. Yet not all had families waiting. Some children stood silently with social workers, watching reunions they weren't part of. Isabella knelt before a girl no older than 6, dress wrinkled, eyes hollow. She gathered her gently into her arms. "It's okay. You're not alone anymore." Nearby, a boy of 10 clenched his fists. "They're not coming, are they?" Isabella steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes families can't be here. But you're not forgotten." Bravo padded over, pressing close until the boy's fingers sank into his fur. The child's mask cracked. The first sound from his chest wasn't quite a sob, but it was released. The courtyard became a mosaic of grief and healing. Officers stood silently, eyes wet. "I've never seen anything like this," one whispered. Ramirez only nodded, gaze on Bravo. Now with 2 children leaning against him, parentless yet anchored by the shepherd's steady presence. Inside, Isabella read softly from a storybook to children too frightened to sleep. "Will Bravo stay?" one asked. She glanced at the doorway, where he lay watchful. "Yes," she said. Relief softened their faces, if only for a moment. As night fell, candles lined the steps, each flame for a child still missing. Families who had found their children clung tight. Others prayed for names yet unreturned. Bravo sat beside Isabella, gaze on the candles, body tense. His eyes seemed to say, "There is more work to be done." Isabella rested her hand on his back. "I know," she whispered. "We're not finished." And so the night stretched on. Families reunited, others waiting, a city relearning how to breathe after silence. Bravo remained steady, the quiet sentinel, watching as broken families began to heal. It wasn't an ending, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Isabella thought, were sometimes the bravest things of all. The courthouse in Santa Aurora loomed like a stone sentinel over the crowd. Families clutched photographs, prayer beads, or each other's hands. Reporters pressed microphones forward. This was no ordinary trial. It was the first step in dismantling a network that had thrived in shadows. Inside, the air was thick with grief and resolve. On the defense bench sat Esteban Calderon, once hailed as a philanthropist, now shackled, lips curled in a fading smirk. His associates, politicians, bankers, smugglers, shifted uneasily under the glares of the families they had betrayed. The judge entered. Court is now in session. Isabella Alvarez was first to testify. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. I am here because of my son Mateo, because his story deserves to be heard, even if he cannot speak it himself. She described the night he vanished, the terror etched into him when he was found, the lullabies sung by his captors. They stole more than his safety. They tried to steal his laughter, but they failed because people refused to look away. Mothers wept openly. Fathers clenched fists to their mouths. Then Ramirez took the stand. Bravo walked beside him, calm and alert. Gasps rippled through the gallery. That's the dog, some whispered. Ramirez laid files on the table. Screens lit up with hidden footage. Men trading children like goods, ledgers of transactions, guards singing the lullaby. Mateo buried his face into his counselor's shoulder. We infiltrated, we traced, we followed the trail, Ramirez said. His hand rested on Bravo's back. At every step, he found what human eyes missed. Without him, many would still be lost. Families testified next, holding sneakers, drawings, toys. Their grief became fury. No more silence, a grandmother declared. You will face what you've done. Even Calderon's smirk faltered. Verdict day dawned under a heavy sky. The streets overflowed with people. Inside, the jury foreman read aloud. We find the defendant, Esteban Calderon, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, abduction, trafficking, crimes against humanity. Gasps became sobs. Mothers clutched children. Fathers bowed their heads. Calderon's mask cracked. Rage flashed before fear. The foreman continued. Guilty verdicts rippling down his network, one name after another, falling like dominoes. The judge delivered the blow. Life imprisonment without parole. Associates, 25 years to life. This court acknowledges the dismantling of a global trafficking ring. Her gavel struck once. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, tears, embraces. Mateo tugged Isabella's sleeve. We won? She gathered him close, nodding through tears. Yes, mi cielo. We won. Calderon was dragged away, face twisted, ignored by all. As he passed, a grandmother whispered, You cannot buy silence anymore. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. The prosecutor turned to Ramirez. You did it. He shook his head. We did. All of us. And him. Bravo barked once, low and steady. It silenced the room for a heartbeat. Then applause broke out anew, this time for the shepherd who had refused to let innocence remain buried. Children stretched hands through the rail to touch his fur. Bravo lowered his head gently, allowing it. Weeks later, the plaza of Santa Aurora glowed in sunlight. Flags rippled. Banners of blue and white framed a stage. Families filled the square, officers and officials among them. But the day was not for politicians. It was for Bravo. He sat at Ramirez's side, posture steady, gaze fixed on the children in the front rows. Mateo waved shyly from his chair. The mayor's voice carried across the crowd. In times of darkness, heroes rise. Sometimes, those heroes walk on 4 legs. He unfolded a citation. Bravo, Service K9. This city and this nation honor your valor. For alerting us to danger, for guiding us to hidden victims, for standing between innocence and evil without hesitation. He gestured to Ramirez. With trembling hands, the detective knelt and placed the medal around Bravo's neck. The dog blinked once, tail giving a restrained wag. The crowd erupted into chants. Bravo! Bravo! Then Mateo climbed from his seat. Gasps rose as he hurried onto the stage. Isabella called out, but he didn't stop. He wrapped his arms around Bravo's neck and whispered into the fur. You saved me. Time froze. Cameras clicked. The image, child and dog locked in embrace, would circle the world within hours. A symbol not of tragedy, but of triumph. Bravo pressed his muzzle gently to Mateo's shoulder, tail wagging freely now, as if he understood. The mayor, voice thick, said into the microphone, There is the greatest testimony of all. Applause rolled like prayer through the square. Mothers wept. Officers wiped their eyes. Even reporters lowered cameras for a moment, unwilling to break the sanctity. When the ceremony ended, Isabella whispered to her son, You gave him the words, mijo, and the world heard them. That night, every news outlet replayed the image. Bravo with his medal, Mateo clinging to him, whispering thanks. Commentators called it a turning point, a crack of light in a shadowed world. And as the sun set, Bravo lay at Ramirez's feet, eyes half closed, finally allowing rest. But even in stillness, one truth remained. The fight wasn't over. Not for Ramirez, not for Bravo, but for this day, for this sacred day. They had given the world what it needed most. Hope. The seasons had shifted in Santa Aurora. Summer had burned into autumn, and autumn quietly surrendered to winter. But inside the small apartment on Calle del Sol, warmth had returned, slow but steady, like a fragile flame coaxed back to life after being nearly extinguished. Mateo sat cross-legged on a woven rug in the living room, his laughter soft at first, then bubbling up into a genuine giggle. It was the sound Isabella had thought she might never hear again. His small hands clutched a wooden toy truck, nudging it along a path he had drawn with crayons across a sheet of paper. His eyes, once clouded with fear, sparkled with the simple joy of play. On the sofa, Isabella watched, one hand pressed to her lips, tears gathering in her eyes. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't dare. For weeks, even months after his rescue, silence had been the language of her child. He had spoken only when pressed. Smiles had been fleeting, brittle, almost forced. But now, here in the safety of home, a laugh had slipped out naturally, unburdened. The therapist had told her it would take time, that healing for children like Mateo was never a straight road, but a winding path with steps forward and steps back. And there had been plenty of steps back, Nightmares that ripped through the dark. Nights where Matteo woke screaming, convinced the shadows on his wall were traffickers coming to steal him again. On those nights, Isabella had clutched him until dawn, whispering lullabies she herself barely remembered from childhood, rocking him as if he were a baby once more. But today was different. Today was proof that light could seep into the cracks. The doorbell chimed, and Matteo's head shot up, eyes darting to his mother. For a brief moment, his shoulders tensed, the instinct of a child who had lived too long in fear. Isabella smiled gently. "It's okay, mijo. You know who that is." The boy's eyes widened, and in an instant he scrambled up, feet pounding across the floor. Isabella followed as he flung the door open. There he was, Bravo, sitting tall in the hallway, his coat glistening even in the dim light. Ramirez stood beside him, dressed down in jeans and a leather jacket, holding a small bag of treats. But Matteo's eyes locked only on the shepherd. "Bravo!" the boy cried, his voice higher and freer than Isabella had heard in months. He flung his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face into the thick fur. Bravo accepted the embrace calmly, tail wagging in measured arcs, his head dipping to rest briefly against Matteo's shoulder. Every visit was like this. Ramirez had made it part of their rhythm. Once a week, sometimes twice, Bravo came to sit with Matteo. The therapist called it animal-assisted healing, but Isabella knew it was something deeper, something no textbook could explain. Bravo wasn't just a therapy dog. He was Matteo's guardian, his proof that monsters could be fought and beaten. Ramirez stepped in, smiling faintly at the sight. "Brought some of those little biscuits he likes. Thought maybe Matteo could give them out this time." Isabella nodded, but she didn't speak. Her throat was too tight with gratitude. Later, they sat together in the living room. Matteo curled on the floor with Bravo, his tiny fingers braiding and unbraiding the shepherd's fur as he whispered things only Bravo could hear. Ramirez and Isabella watched in silence, the television muted, the only sound the boy's soft murmur and the occasional thump of Bravo's tail against the rug. "He's different," Ramirez said at last, his voice low. "Better," Isabella answered. Her eyes never left her son. "He still wakes at night, still asks if they'll come back for him. But the fear doesn't own him anymore." Ramirez leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You know, Bravo doesn't rest easy either. He still paces the apartment some nights, like he's guarding against enemies that aren't there. But when he's here, with Matteo, he heals too," Isabella finished softly. Their eyes met, an unspoken truth passing between them. That sometimes, the ones who save us are the ones who need saving themselves. The days turned into weeks. Matteo began to speak more freely in therapy sessions, sometimes even drawing pictures to explain his feelings. One sketch showed a tall figure with cruel eyes, labeled simply, "the bad one." Another showed Bravo, larger than life, with Matteo clinging to his back, as if being carried away from darkness. The therapist framed that one, saying it was proof of resilience, a child reframing trauma into survival. At school, the transition was slower. Matteo clung to Isabella at drop-off, his knuckles white against her coat. But little by little, he started to wave goodbye, instead of cry. One afternoon, when Isabella picked him up, she found him laughing with another boy over a shared snack. The sound nearly brought her to her knees. At night, the nightmares lingered, but they were less frequent. And on the nights when fear clawed its way back, Bravo's visits left an imprint. Matteo would clutch a stuffed shepherd toy, gifted by Ramirez, and whisper, "Bravo's here. He'll keep me safe," before drifting back to sleep. Isabella, too, found her own healing. For months, she had lived in a state of permanent alarm, jolting awake at the slightest sound, triple-checking the locks, leaving lights on in every room. Slowly, with therapy and time, her body remembered rest. One night, for the first time since the abduction, she slept through till morning. She woke in tears, but they were tears of relief. One crisp Saturday morning, Isabella found Matteo on the balcony, humming to himself as he watched the city stir awake. He turned, a shy smile lighting his face. "Mother," he said, his voice steady, "I'm not scared anymore, because Bravo always finds me." Her chest ached with the beauty of it. She swept him into her arms, pressing her cheek against his hair, inhaling the scent of crayons and sunshine. "That's right, mijo. He'll always find you." And in that moment, Isabella realized something vital. The monsters had taken months from them, months of silence, of fear, of sleepless nights. But they hadn't won. They hadn't stolen Matteo's laughter forever. They hadn't taken her hope. Life had returned, fragile but resilient. That evening, as Bravo lay curled near the door, and Matteo fell asleep on the sofa, Isabella stood at the window. The city glowed with streetlights, ordinary and alive. For the first time in so long, she let her shoulders drop. Peace wasn't a sudden arrival. It was a slow, patient guest, knocking softly until you found the courage to let it in. And at last, Isabella had opened the door. Behind her, Bravo stirred, lifting his head to glance at her. His amber eyes seemed to hold a message she couldn't put into words. "It isn't finished, but you are safe now." And for the first time, Isabella believed it. It began with a mural. In the heart of Santa Aurora, on the weathered wall of an old elementary school, an artist painted Bravo. The shepherd's likeness stretched tall, eyes lifted toward the horizon, chest proud. At his side, a child's small hand reached out, Matteo's hand, though no name was written. Above them, in wide, flowing letters, was one word: Fidelidad, loyalty. The mural was finished overnight, unveiled to the city at dawn. People stopped in their tracks. Mothers clutching children paused to touch the painted fur. School children pointed, whispering about the dog that had saved El Niño Perdido. By noon, photographs of the mural flooded social media. By dusk, news anchors were calling it a new emblem of Argentina's fight against trafficking. But that mural was only the beginning. Within weeks, murals of Bravo appeared across Santa Aurora, then Rosario, Mendoza, and finally Buenos Aires itself. Some showed him mid-leap, muscles taut, teeth bared, as though frozen in the moment he had ripped Matteo free from darkness. Others captured him calm and watchful, sitting like a sentinel beside children in playgrounds, classrooms, and plazas. Artists took liberties. Sometimes his fur shimmered gold, sometimes his eyes glowed like embers, but always the essence was the same: strength without cruelty, power guided by loyalty. Soon, statues followed. A bronze Bravo was erected in Santa Aurora's central square. A child carved at his side, his little fingers tucked into the shepherd's mane. Tourists wept as they posed before it. Locals left flowers and children's toys at its base. Survivors of trafficking left notes of gratitude. Gracias, Bravo. You gave us back our children. Even the president attended the unveiling, her hand pressed over her heart as she declared Bravo not just a dog, but a national hero. News of Bravo's story traveled far beyond Argentina's borders. International outlets replayed the footage of Mateo toddling up to hug Bravo at the medal ceremony. That clip, less than 30 seconds long, became one of the most shared videos in the world. It was replayed in classrooms, aired on morning shows, and even used in sermons. In it, viewers saw not just a dog and a child, but something eternal, the bond of trust that had defied cruelty and won. Soon, Bravo's image appeared on posters in Madrid, T-shirts in New York, and banners in Manila. Schools taught his story as part of anti-trafficking awareness programs. Children drew pictures of him in notebooks, scribbling words like protector and amigo. He became a symbol not just of Argentina, but of every place where children had been stolen, silenced, or lost. And with his fame came something greater: action. In the months after the trial, donations to anti-trafficking organizations surged. Advocacy groups launched the Bravo Initiative, a global campaign funding rescue missions, survivor therapy programs, and cross-border investigations. Every brochure bore his likeness. Every gala ended with the story of the shepherd who refused to let the world look away. Even governments responded. Argentina passed the Bravo Act, mandating stronger protections for children and harsher penalties for traffickers. Across Latin America, leaders invoked Bravo's story when pushing for reforms. Isabella often found herself in awe of it all. Sometimes she would turn on the television to see Bravo's image towering behind a podium at an international summit, while leaders spoke of hope and justice. Other times, she would pass a bookstore and see his story immortalized in children's picture books, illustrations of the shepherd guiding lost children home. Mateo had one of those books, and he read it over and over, though he already knew the story by heart. "Bravo's everywhere," Mateo told her once, his voice filled with wonder. "He makes sure no kid ever feels alone." For Ramirez, the legacy carried a heavier weight. He was proud. How could he not be? But he also knew Bravo was still flesh and blood. At night, while the world painted him as an indestructible symbol, Ramirez still brushed Bravo's coat, checked the scars on his paw pads, and whispered quiet thanks. To the world, Bravo was an icon. To Ramirez, he was family. Yet even Ramirez admitted the legacy mattered. He attended conferences where survivors spoke with trembling voices, saying it was Bravo's story that had given them courage to testify. He watched donations funnel into shelters that once struggled to feed children. He stood in plazas as mothers carried candles beneath Bravo's murals, chanting for justice. One evening, he brought Isabella and Mateo to the statue in Santa Aurora. The square was alive with music and voices, but when Mateo approached the bronze figure, silence seemed to fall around him. He reached out, touching the cold metal paw with reverence. "Gracias, Bravo," the boy whispered. Ramirez's throat tightened. Beside him, Isabella clasped her son's shoulders, her eyes wet. For her, Bravo's legacy was not just statues or murals. It was the fact that her son was alive, laughing again, dreaming again. That was the true monument. Around the world, Bravo became shorthand for courage. In Kenya, a shelter for rescued children painted his name across their gates. In Canada, a school held an art contest where every entry featured him. In Japan, a documentary filmmaker produced Bravo, the Dog Who Defied the Dark, which won awards and drew standing ovations. But the most powerful tribute came not from governments or artists, but from the children themselves. Survivors wrote letters, hundreds, then thousands, addressed simply to Bravo, the brave dog. Ramirez and Isabella kept them in boxes. Some were drawings of dogs with wings, some were just scribbled words. "Thank you for finding me. I wish you were my dog. Because of you, I believe the world can be safe again." Matteo sometimes sat with those letters spread around him, reading them aloud to Bravo as if the shepherd could understand every word. And perhaps, in some way, he did. Bravo always lay quietly as the words filled the room, his tail flicking in steady rhythm. The legacy did not erase the scars. Trafficking still existed. There were still dark places in the world. But Bravo's story had shifted something. It had proven that light could break through, that loyalty and courage could ripple outward, touching lives that had never even met him. In the quiet of their home, Isabella sometimes thought of the mural that had started it all. The painted child reaching for Bravo's mane, the single word above them, Fidelidad. She realized now it wasn't just a tribute to a dog. It was a reminder to everyone that loyalty, love, and courage could become weapons against even the darkest crimes. And as long as those things lived, there was hope. That night, as Isabella tucked Matteo into bed, he asked softly, "Mama, do you think Bravo knows that the whole world loves him?" She brushed his hair back, smiling. "I think he feels it, mi amor. In every hug, every picture, every child who whispers his name, Bravo knows." Downstairs, Bravo lifted his head as if he had heard. His amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, not with pride, but with quiet understanding. To him, legacy didn't mean statues or medals. It meant the child was sleeping safe upstairs. It meant laughter where there had once been silence. The world called him a hero. Bravo simply did what he was born to do. And in that truth lay the heart of his legacy. The river was quiet that evening. The same river where everything had begun, that night of terror when Isabella's screams were swallowed by the dark, and Bravo had lunged into destiny. Now, months later, the water flowed steady and calm, glowing gold beneath the sinking sun. The air smelled of wild reeds and damp earth, carrying with it the hum of cicadas, a lullaby of summer. Isabella stood at the riverbank, her arms folded loosely, eyes soft as she watched her son. Matteo was barefoot, his little feet pressing into the cool mud, trousers rolled up to his knees. He giggled as he lifted a stick almost too heavy for him, then flung it toward the water with all the force his tiny arms could muster. The stick landed with a splash. Bravo bounded after it. His paws churned the bank, sending mud flying, before he leapt into the current. Water closed over him for a heartbeat. Then his head broke the surface, ears slicked back, amber eyes shining with focus. He paddled, seized the stick in his jaws, and returned to shore triumphant, dropping it at Matteo's feet. "Otra vez, Bravo!" Matteo laughed, his voice clear and ringing, so different from the fragile, broken whispers of months ago. He grabbed the stick again, determined to throw it farther this time. Isabella's heart swelled as she watched. For so long, Matteo's laughter had been lost, drowned in nightmares, muted by fear. Now, here it was again, rising into the evening like music. She let herself breathe in the scene, each detail etching itself into her memory. The shimmer of water catching the last light, the silhouette of Bravo shaking droplets into the air like diamonds, the small boy with his cheeks flushed pink, alive and whole. There had been so many nights when she thought they would never reach this point. Nights when Matteo woke screaming, drenched in sweat, his little fists clinging to her shirt. Nights when she couldn't close her eyes, fearing the shadows would steal him again. But step by step, through therapy, patience, and Bravo's steady presence, they had climbed out of the abyss together. Bravo had visited often, padding through the doorway with Ramirez at his side, lying beside Mateo's bed until the boy finally slept, his breath steady. When Mateo trembled during therapy, Bravo pressed his head against his knee, anchoring him. When Isabella's own strength faltered, Bravo's eyes seemed to remind her, "We survived. Keep going." Now, as the river carried the last light of the sun downstream, Isabella felt something she hadn't dared believe in for so long. Peace. "Mother Mira," Mateo shouted suddenly, his small arm pointing toward the horizon. She followed his gaze. The sun was sinking low, its fire bleeding across the sky. Orange melting into crimson, crimson into violet. The reflection rippled over the river like spilled paint, carrying with it the weight of endings and the promise of beginnings. Isabella knelt, her dress brushing the damp grass, and wrapped an arm around Mateo as he leaned into her side. Together, they watched Bravo plunge into the water again, tail wagging, strong and tireless, even as the current pulled at him. "Does it feel different, Mateo?" she asked softly. The boy thought for a moment, chewing his lip. Then he nodded. "It's not scary anymore. The river. It feels like it's saying goodbye to the bad things." Isabella blinked back tears. Out of the mouths of children came truths too simple and too profound for adults to hold. "Yes, my love," she whispered, pressing a kiss into his hair. "It carries everything away." The water lapped at the bank, each wave erasing the footprints they left behind. It was as if the river itself was determined to wash away the memories of screams, chains, and shadows. In their place remained only the quiet strength of survival, the proof that darkness could not win forever. Bravo emerged once more, his fur slick, jaws clamped proudly around the stick. He shook himself, sending arcs of water into the air. Mateo squealed and clapped, falling backward into the grass. The dog stood over him, tail thumping, as if daring him to throw again. Mateo reached up, hugging Bravo's soaked neck without hesitation. "I love you, Bravo," he murmured, his voice muffled against wet fur. Isabella caught the moment, tucking it into her heart like a jewel. Cameras had captured Bravo before, immortalizing him for the world. But here was the truth no lens could ever fully hold. Bravo was not a statue, nor a mural, nor a headline. He was flesh and blood, beating heart and loyal soul. A guardian, a friend. And for them, he was family. The sun sank lower, its reflection stretching long and golden. Ramirez's voice called from a little distance, steady, familiar. He had given them this space, understanding its weight, but now he approached with his easy stride, hands in his pockets. "Time to head home soon," he said gently. Isabella glanced at him, gratitude in her eyes. Home. The word no longer carried fear, only safety. Together, they had built something no darkness could undo. Mateo yawned, rubbing his eyes, but before they left, he picked up the stick one last time. With all his strength, he hurled it far into the glowing water. "Go, Bravo!" he cried. The shepherd leapt forward once more, chasing the stick into the current. Isabella watched him swim, his body cutting cleanly through the water, strong against the flow. She thought of everything he had faced, the guns, the chains, the cruelty of men, and yet here he was, still running, still fighting, still carrying light into the world. Bravo reached the stick, clamped it firmly, and turned back, his eyes reflecting the last fire of the sun. As the shepherd bounded ashore, Isabella closed her eyes for a moment. She let the sound of water, laughter, and pause fill her senses. She let the weight of grief drift downstream, carried away with the fading day. When she opened her eyes, the sky was darker now, but brighter too, streaked with stars beginning to appear. She felt the quiet strength of survival settle in her chest. They had not only endured, they had reclaimed joy. She took Mateo's hand in hers, warm and small, and whispered, "Come on, let's go home." Bravo padded beside them, shaking off droplets, the stick still clamped in his jaws, as if victory itself belonged to him. Together they walked away from the river, leaving the current to carry what it must. Behind them, the water flowed endlessly, pulling shadows with it, making room for tomorrow. And in that twilight, with laughter lingering in the air and hope carved deep into their steps, Isabella knew the truth. They had survived. They would keep surviving. And because of Bravo, they would never walk alone again. Sometimes the simplest truths are the ones that stay with us the longest. A loyal dog can carry us through storms we never thought we'd survive. German shepherds, especially, remind us what love looks like when it's steady, patient, and without condition. They don't ask for much, just our time, our kindness, and the chance to walk beside us. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt understood without a word, you already know the kind of healing that bond can bring. Stories like Bravo's are powerful not because they're rare, but because deep down, many of us have felt that same loyalty curled up at our feet or waiting by the door. If you'd like to explore ways to strengthen that bond with your own dog, there's a resource I found helpful that offers gentle, thoughtful guidance. You don't have to, of course, but if your heart is telling you it might be time to lean in closer to the connection you already share, you might enjoy it. Think of it as one more walk you can take together, down a path that makes both of your lives a little richer.